I didn't bring my gavel. Hi, I'm Penny Brasher, and I'm one of the co-directors of the Center for Clinical Epidemiology and Evaluation. And thank you so much for coming to today's lecture. Before we get started, we'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered today on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. The way this is going to run today is we're just thrilled to have Courtney Howard here giving our annual lecture, and we're equally thrilled that Andrea McNeil is here to start off the discussion after the lecture, and after that we will open up questions and comments to the audience. There's a reception afterwards, and we hope that you'll stick around and talk to people. And it's my pleasure now to introduce Margaret McGregor, who's a longtime associate with the center. She's a family physician at UBC and was recently made a board member of Vancouver Coastal Health. So, Margaret, thank you.
So it is my very, very great pleasure to introduce Courtney Howard. Courtney is a UBC and McGill-trained emergency physician in Yellowknife. She's the board president of something called the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, aka CAPE. You might hear her refer to that in her presentation. And she was first author on the Lancet Countdown 2017 report, Briefing for Canadian Policymakers. Courtney has led the successful campaign to have the Canadian Medical Association divest from fossil fuels, not an easy task. She has researched wildfires and menstrual cups, and she's contributed to advocacy on active transport, plant-rich diets, health impact assessments, carbon pricing, coal phase-out, and hydraulic fracturing. Courtney represented the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment on the Global Climate and Health Alliance Board, most recently at COP23 in Paris. And finally, you have her Twitter handle here. She's a great Twitterer, and she has a fabulous TED Talk, and I really encourage you to check out that TED Talk. The nice thing about TED Talks is they're short. So welcome, Courtney.
Thanks, Margaret, and thanks so much for all your support over the years. I think you introduced me the last time I spoke in Vancouver, so thank you. So thanks to everybody for coming. I love talking about this, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts when we're done. So let's just start talking about this slide. So I live in Yellowknife. Yellowknife is already 2.5 degrees Celsius warmer than it was in the 1950s. And I basically work at the home of the most northerly CT scanner in northern Canada. And I take calls from all the Indigenous communities north of us up to the high Arctic Circle. So this is actually a photo that I took when I was flying between Inuvik, which is the Northern Hospital Center, and a little town called Aklavik, which is more or less on a sandbar in the Mackenzie River Delta. And this part of the world is already 3 degrees Celsius warmer than it was in the 1950s. It's one of the most rapidly warming places on the planet. So you can see that river there, that's the Mackenzie River. So sometimes it's called the Northern Amazon. It drains a tremendous watershed. And that's a river for people when it freezes up in the wintertime. So this was in about November, so it hadn't completely frozen yet. So this is basically how people transport building supplies. They use it to go visit their friends and family. Otherwise, it's a flying community. You can imagine those flights are pretty expensive. And it's also how they go hunting. So the Indigenous communities where I live and north of us still have a substantial amount of their lean protein that comes from food from the land. And when you think about how expensive it would be to fly in all the food to these communities, it's really by far the most economically feasible way for people to get healthy food. So it's a big deal when all of a sudden you go from solid ice to liquid ice, and the shoulder seasons become much more dicey in terms of safe passage across the ice. You can see that the delta has tons and tons of little lakes too. So even in between those lakes, there's permafrost, and the permafrost as it warms up gets much boggier. So that's not only difficult for people, but that's difficult for caribou, for other animals. They get bogged down, they go through the ice too, their foodstuffs are affected. So there's essentially food security challenges, there's social connectedness challenges, there's challenges to different sort of cultural sharing practices when, the harvests aren't quite what they used to be. And there's growing evidence of mental health impacts from this rapidly changing landscape. There's a physician, or she's actually a researcher in Northern Labrador named Ashley Consulo, who has documented quite profound impacts in the Inuit in Northern Labrador as a result of their similar rapidly changing landscape. So serving this population as I do, climate change is really kind of in the foreground. And so I became quite aware of it about maybe 8 to 10 years ago now, and I've been working more or less half-time on it, mostly on a volunteer basis since then. So meanwhile, so I actually trained here. So I found out I got into med school when I was working at the old BC Research Pavilion, and then did my very first time on the wards, like several hundred meters up from where we're standing right now. So I trained in healthcare structures like this to work in healthcare structures like this, and I thought that was what health was about. And so I had like major laptop issues over the last couple of days. So what you're about to see is the result of me sitting in the Apple store with my like anxiety purchased laptop, trying to figure out how to use a drawing program while I waited for the genius. So like I got a C+ in art in grade 7. That was the last time I ever took art. So I might need some encouraging smiles. So I've been looking for a way to illustrate how we all depend on the ecological determinants of health. I didn't even know these were a thing until quite recently. So these are things like oxygen, ozone, fuel, climate, everything that we actually depend on, many of these services that we take for granted. And it's really those ecological determinants of health that form the support for the social determinants of health that we're getting better about talking about in healthcare. But when you think about it, all those things we talk about, so money, social supports, housing, employment, education, none of that would be possible without the ecosystem supporting it from underneath. Like if you take out food, everything above it collapses, right? You take out oxygen, we're done, okay? And that's why as the ecology becomes more unstable, our ability to maintain all of our healthy determinants really decreases. So, and it takes all of that to build up a civilization with sort of enough know-how and enough resource to be able to support a structure like the one that we're sitting in right now. And so we know now, and I hated learning this when I learned it, that healthcare is only responsible for 20 to 30% of health outcomes, depending on, I'm sure there's people who know the stats better than I do, but it's about that. And so, it's all of this that adds up to health. And I didn't know any of that when I was standing here, a few floors up going to morning report on insurance. And I think our challenge at this moment in time is to, as healthcare practitioners, start to figure out how we interact with all the rest of this. So this concept is sort of being wrapped into a new term called planetary health. And I'd encourage you all to start to take a look at it. We have someone who's published in the new journal, Lancet Planetary Health. And I think the easiest way to figure out what this means, I really like this quote. Simply put, it's the health of human civilization and the state of the natural systems upon which it depends. So we're not talking about this is not about hugging trees for the sake of feeling good. I am a pretty anthropocentric human, like truth be told, and I'm really about having healthy humans. That's what I care about the most. I agree, biodiversity is important, but I'm kind of selfish and I mostly want them so that my kids have a healthy future. And it turns out I'm kind of like a lot of humans. A lot of humans are kind of selfish like that. And so the opportunity of us becoming involved in this conversation is we start to lend some of that human-based, sort of naturally selfish way of thinking to the support of what actually sustains us. Now, I know you all had a smoky summer this last year, and I've already spoken with quite a few people who mentioned that it made them feel sad. So, the Inuit living up north are not the only people who develop emotional attachments to land and who feel sad when things change. So Karen Rose is in the audience. Where is she? Way up there. So Karen's been my best friend since I was practically born. And she's been helping me with math since I was 7, and her dad decided to make us do algebra on a napkin at a restaurant. And I was the only person who thought that was weird that day. So anyway, when I do research, I go knocking on our door and I usually pay her in high-quality cinnamon buns. So we did a study into a horrible wildfire event that we had in Yellowknife. It lasted about 2.5 months. It was in 2014. It was the worst urban smoke exposure in Canadian history at the time. And what we found was, yes, our PM 2.5 was horrible. Yes, our asthma rates doubled. But moreover, we had quite a substantial qualitative arm that showed that people really felt sad. They felt sad in the day, kind of bummed out, almost an SAD type feeling. They had decreased levels of physical activity. So that essentially, not only were they cooped up inside, but they weren't getting the treatment that physical activity can even provide for things like different chronic diseases, including anxiety and depression. And it was marked a real separation from the land and from cultural activities for Indigenous population. And many people saw it as sort of a sentinel event that made them wonder what the world was going to be like. Is this a new normal? So there was a lot of interest in this during this last wildfire season. And if you had some of those feelings, I just wanted to sort of say up front, like, those are really normal. From the evidence base, we're learning those are really normal. And I think talking about them is a way for us to figure out, to develop more insight into those feelings. And I think that's going to help us make better decisions. So not just in a sort of ooey gooey way, but you know, if you think about a mental status exam that you do on a patient, if they came in with a psychiatric illness, you know, the first question is, do they have insight into how they're feeling or what's affecting them? And then how does that impact their judgment? So I think this is actually quite an important practical conversation for us to have as well. So I'm just going to quickly go through the mental health or the other health impacts of climate change. This is from the TED Talk, so I apologize. You're going to watch it. You're going to be like, oh my God, she's repeating material. So ice melt, that's what's happening where I live. The rest of this is drawn from a 2012 British Medical Journal article by McMichael et al. With a little bit of Watts 2015 and a little bit of Sam Myers thrown in. So immediate and direct risks, there will be immediate and direct risks to health from climate change, which we're already seeing. Indirect risks and risks associated with conflict and environmental refugee flows. So heat waves, drought, heat stroke, we see this already. You know, there were 90 heat-related deaths in Quebec this last summer. Wildfires, as we've already talked about, increasing, extreme wildfires increasing faster, lead to cardiovascular, respiratory problems, mental health impacts we now know. Storms, the big storms we had down in the Gulf last year, not only increase potential for injury, evacuation, post-PTSD associated with those events, but they also can impact healthcare facilities. So there was a med school that was rendered non-functional by those storms, took out one of the world's leading suppliers of normal saline in Puerto Rico. So we actually had a normal saline shortage associated with that as far north as Yellowknife months later. So, you know, I think sometimes in the global north, we sometimes had the feeling that we're somewhat separate from this, and it's just becoming clearer and clearer over the last few years that we're simply not. From there, you know, immediate injury, all of these weather events, air pollution is getting worse as there's sort of increased heat increases the conversion of different precursors to ground level ozone, which is particularly bad for health. And all of this is being driven largely by an increase in various greenhouse gas emissions, including CO2. And what I think people in this audience will probably, it'll be a bit more intuitive than in some other audiences, but that's going to equilibrate with water bodies underneath. And as we know from blood gases that we do when we're in clinical work, CO2 actually acts like an acid when it's in water bodies. So that's really bad news for the fish. It's also bad news for the about 1 billion people in the world who depend a lot on food from the ocean as their main source of protein. So that brings us to malnutrition. So malnutrition is forecast to be the main health impact of climate change in the 21st century. And this tends to impact vulnerable people. Women tend to be the last to eat in many cultures, kids, elderly people. And this was really brought home to me in a big way when I spent 6 months working with Doctors Without Borders on a pediatric malnutrition project in the Horn of Africa. I had one pediatric patient die under me before going there. It was at Montreal General Hospital. We ran a code on that little person for like an hour. There were at least 5 attendings present. And then when we were done, the attending went home because she was so upset. And then I show up in this tent hospital in Djibouti, and we had pediatric deaths all the time. And we just had to keep going. And what was the most humbling for me was that every time a child died, almost every time, the mom would take my hand and she would say, "Thank you. Thank you for caring for my child." Like, when you've just lost a pediatric patient and their mom's response is to thank you for your care, like, it just makes you want to fall through the floor in humility. So there was during one of those days, it was a diarrhea outbreak. We'd had a bunch of little people dead on arrival, and it was that same circumstance that I just was filled with like a white hot wave of rage that this happens to kids at all. And I said to myself that I would do everything I could when I got home to Canada to prevent further similar deaths, because by then it was pretty clear to me that that wasn't going to be the place where I was going to be able to exert systems change, because I didn't understand the culture or the language well enough to do it. So I came home, and it turned out I had a kid almost right after that, did some reading on climate change, and it turns out that that meant working on climate change. So as we sort of progress through increasing cycles of dysfunction, you could imagine that if your kid didn't have anything to eat, you'd want to, you'd do anything to find them something to eat. So you could move to somewhere where there was more food, and those people might not like it that you came. So population displacement, potential conflict are scheduled or thought to be some of the main consequences. And there's already evidence, although it's contested, the whole evidence base around climate change and conflict needs work. But generally speaking, most academics in the field do believe that there's already an association. And out of Syria have come some studies that have shown that basically 5 years of climate-related drought leading to poor crops led to rural to urban migration, so that it was a really unstable population in the cities that were met by the spark of the Arab Spring. So one factor only leading to the conflict. So as this kind of goes round and round and round, sea level rise, more people moving, people are stressed out, it's not good. So like in Emerge, we like technical terms like badness. So we're kind of heading towards a cycle of badness that can definitely lead to systemic and economic collapse. And so the 2017 Countdown report basically shows that we're heading for about 2.6 to 4.8 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100. They're quoting IPCC stats. We think we can stay relatively safe if we stay under 1.5 degrees Celsius worldwide. So we're imminently heading way beyond what is safe. In terms of the triage level of this issue at this moment in time, because it's the next 10 to 15 years, we really have to turn this boat around. I would argue that this is the number one thing that we need to be working on. So that news doesn't sit well. The first time that really landed for me, my daughter was 6 months old, and I spent about 40 minutes curled up around her in the fetal position. So that's normal to have that kind of a reaction. I've since spoken with many people who have had a time like that. I think I had dysthymia for about 6 months after that. And I think it's important we take care of one another, we take care of ourselves, and we acknowledge that this is a thing. And also to acknowledge that most days are great, if you don't have horrible dental pain or, a raging urinary tract infection or the smoke, what a beautiful clear day we have today, right? So there's a lot of time and reason to take pleasure in the present moment, because that will help to give you the energy to do the work that needs doing. And someone who's really good at that actually just entered the auditorium, Melissa Lem. That's you, right? I don't have my glasses on. Back there has been really an emerging voice on the health impacts of being in nature. So I think one of the best things that we can do as some of our self-care is to go reconnect with nature. There's an increasing evidence base around the health impacts of being in nature, and she's been leading walks with Starla Bob and other Indigenous people who know a lot about the local plants and the other things that can help sustain us with kids in Stanley Park and other places. So I'd encourage you to sort of make some of those practices part of your own. Now, the cool thing about this is that there's a lot that we can do to decrease greenhouse gas emissions that also have immediate benefits for health, and we'll go through that in some detail. So Nick Watts, who's my current boss, he's 28. My current boss is 28. He had just graduated from medical school when he basically was the lead author of the 2015 Commission on Climate Change for the Lancet. And they totally reframed the conversation by saying that responding to climate change could be the biggest global health opportunity of the 21st century. So it's the biggest global health threat and the biggest global health opportunity. The WHO now calls it the biggest global health threat. And what was also in that report, which was a super multidisciplinary report with a bunch of economists and finance people and ecologists and you name it, there was a discipline present in that report. They'd all talk to one another and realize that there was actually not a limiting factor in anyone's discipline for us getting this done. So their statement was that achieving a decarbonized global economy and securing the public health benefits that it offers is no longer primarily a technical or an economic question. Okay? It's a matter of getting it done. So that leads to the question, well, who's in charge? Like, who gets this done? So there's evidence to show that presenting climate change in a health frame is the best way to motivate a population to take action. So number one, we don't talk about polar bears, we talk about people. And the messenger matters. So you can see who's at the top of that, right? This is why I'm here talking to you. And take a look at who's generally leading the conversation. Our ministers, our politicians, how do they do? So is the right person in charge of running this planetary code right now, would you say? Right? I mean, we could put the hairdressers in charge. I think we'd have a pretty good outcome. But generally speaking, like, we need to step up here. And we're going to start to do that at the numbers we need by starting to include this in curricula. And this is long since due. So I was asked to speak at the International Federation of Medical Students Association conference in Montreal in August, and the Canadian medical students had already decided that, like, this needs to be at least have a foothold in curricula for medicine. You know, these are med students, so we're targeting medicine, but this could be any health faculty by 2020. And it turned out that that was consistent with policy for the IFMSA, so we've launched an international campaign to try to get this into curriculum by 2020. Okay, I would love it if my alma mater was one of the forerunners here. So I'm happy to provide any assistance, and we'll definitely come pestering. Part of this is going to be actually internet-based marking schemes. So we're planning on, like, publicly praising people who are doing well here and calling out people who aren't, or institutions who aren't, because we all know curriculum change can take a really, really long time, and we simply don't have time, and it's too important for us to go through that whole sort of archaic kind of change procedure. So other ways, once you get your profession sort of briefed, you know, you can start to take ownership of that and act within the profession in a way that makes sense. So that was one of the reasons we asked the Canadian Medical Association to divest from fossil fuels. So, you know, do no harm is one of our basic tenets. So we didn't feel that it was consistent to invest in fossil fuels. And so this has been, we were part of a wave of divestment that just recently included the American Medical Association. So the World Medical Association, International Federation of Medical Students Associations, Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons from Australia, British Medical Association have all divested. And that campaign is ongoing at UBC. I participated in those discussions for a while, but I don't know where it's at. But that's a place where you guys can really also have, have a voice and an action item to be associated with this. So how do we increase health at the same time as we decrease CO2 emissions? One of the most important things we can do on a global health scale, but it's still of relevance here in Canada, given that we don't provide coverage for a lot of people to get access to contraception, is to make sure that women and girls have access to both education and to the family planning that they tell us that they want. There's a big gap here. So whether we're talking about adaptation, which is adapting to the health impacts of climate change that we can't at this point prevent, there's evidence to show that the combination of education and access to family planning essentially is one of the best ways to help a family be resilient to a natural disaster. And that totally makes sense, right? Like, if you're a woman who can read and has potentially a smaller family, you're going to have so many more tools at your disposal if you have to respond to, a storm or a, what have you, or malnutrition emergency. It also increases yields on the farms of women smallholder farmers. So if you have less access to education, you're not going to have access to the same farming techniques, the same technical skills as your male counterparts. If we can even that out, we'll protect families from malnutrition, and we'll reduce maternal and infant mortality and the size of families, which reduces the carbon footprint. So that's probably one of the main places where we can really take action. Now, when you look at what actually kills Canadians, so these are the chronic diseases that kill Canadians, so cancer, heart disease, stroke, chronic respiratory disease, and diabetes. Air pollution is a factor in many of those. Now, Canada is way better than, for instance, I was in Hong Kong recently. It looked like a wildfire just happened. It was so smoggy. But that's why phasing out coal power is really the #1 target of the international climate change and health community, because it's responsible for about 800,000 air pollution-related deaths worldwide, as well as 44% of global CO2 emissions. So this is actually something that we've been pretty successful at doing as a health community here in Canada. So in Ontario, a coalition of community members, municipalities, and healthcare professionals actually got coal power phased out in Ontario, which was the single largest decrease in greenhouse gas emissions that's happened via a single policy measure in North America. And based on that, the Pembina Institute, which is an energy think tank, and CAPE and some other medical bodies and health bodies in Alberta wondered if the same thing was possible in Alberta. So CAPE, the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment that Margaret was referring to, of which I'm the president right now, ran a concerted campaign in Alberta that's still slightly ongoing, but we managed to achieve a commitment from the Alberta government to phase out coal power by 2030. And that was on the basis of talking about asthma. So we didn't really talk about climate change. In Alberta, only sort of depends on the study, but it's something like 45% to 65% of people like really believe in climate change, but nobody wants to see a kid home from school with an asthma exacerbation. And nobody wants to pay, you know, the healthcare costs associated with a needless asthma exacerbation either. So it was on the basis of arguments like that we won the political commitment. And Joe Vipon, like the emergency physician there in the picture, was like, has driven this process for 5 years. And he basically woke up about a month after that announcement, was like, Courtney, I think we should take this national. And I was like, it was Christmas time. I was like, Joel, like, can we just have a nice dinner with our families? He's like, no, we need to strategize. I was like, okay. So we did. And so we recruited influential physicians from all of the coal-burning provinces. We married them, also spoke with the environmental groups in those provinces. We had monthly teleconferences. It was mostly not outward-facing coalitions. So we would have these teleconferences, but speak as separate voices externally to essentially give the impression that the same message was being given by different groups to increase our effectiveness. And we did manage to achieve a commitment to a national coal power phase out by 2030. And what that set up was Canada to lead something that's called the Powering Past Coal Alliance in association with the UK, who have a similar commitment that was also won with tremendous support from health professionals there. And so they are now, I think there's about 20 national governments have signed on to the Powering Past Coal Alliance, quite a few subnationals and also NGOs and businesses. And they needed a doctor to speak at their announcement. They wanted to highlight the voice of health. They wanted Nick Watts, but he'd left town, so they got me. But, you know, I listened, just from a storytelling perspective, the voice of health brings a lot to the table, because I could sit there with I had an asthma puffer in my pocket, and I pulled it out, and I talked about asthma, and I talked about the kids. And that's what I could talk about at the table. I talked about malnutrition just like I just did. You know, you're a politician talking about that stuff, or you're an energy planner. What's your story? Like, what's your convincing human level story that's going to change minds? We have access to these human stories that we have this privilege of being with patients and of participating in the human dramas that really move people. And that's just another thing that we bring to the table. That's why we've had success. So as we decrease air pollution by making more clean energy and we decrease CO2, that also gives us the opportunity to extract less fossil fuels, because there's problems associated with that. So one of the things that has been difficult, and I have a slide out of order here. So another thing we need to do is decrease driving cars, so switch to active transport, cycling and walking. Cycling actually decreases mortality, so there's very few things that we can prescribe for a population that decrease mortality. Cycling does. So I know that there's already researchers here looking at increasing rates of active transport. We spoke earlier. And, that's a fantastic thing to be focusing on. So getting back to resource extraction, so I kind of got into this actually by reading a book about the oil sands. And then I was like, this does not sound good. I'm going to go to Up to Date. That is actually where I was so naive. I thought I was going to find a well-packaged article about the health impacts of the oil sands on Up to Date. I was like, there's nothing on Up to Date. So then I went to PubMed. And guess what? There was nothing there either. This was in 2011. And so then I was astonished because I'd read a whole bunch in the popular literature about it. They were already making movies. I was very confused about what was happening. I thought my first motion ever at the Canadian Medical Association was to ask them to ask for more peer-reviewed studies into the health impacts of the oil sands. And I just got completely yelled at. And so it started to become clear to me why we hadn't done this. But unfortunately, I redid this lit review this summer. There's still nothing. These are our most vulnerable communities. This is an era of reconciliation. And yeah, there's basically one thing talking about potential for increased cancer rates in one place. There's a Health Canada related study on precursors and air pollution, but it doesn't come down to an individual level. There was a study that was done that hasn't yet made it into the sort of peer-reviewed literature base that is in progress. But as far as I can tell, that's all. Almost none of it has taken traditional knowledge into account. Almost none of it has taken anything in terms of cultural values or cumulative impacts into account. And we live in one of the most well-resourced, best research capable countries in the world. So what's happened is that our Indigenous people are having to go give keynote addresses at the American Public Health Association, as Ariel Deranger of the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation did. This was the biggest talk at this conference. The biggest talk at the biggest public health conference on the planet was given by one of our Indigenous people asking for more research. And unfortunately, this situation is also of relevance here in BC because of our giant fracking operation that's happening in the northern part of the province that unfortunately we're not aware of. So this is Willa Thixon. She's now CAPE's board member. This was the day I asked her if she wanted to be a board member. She was giving a presentation at the MSAC as a second-year med student. She is from Indigenous communities on both sides of the BC-Alberta border. And this is what she had to say about the amount of attention she felt that her communities had been granted by the research and health communities. And this broke my heart, this slide. You know? So she is so driven to try to do good in this sphere. She, like, the burden that you can almost palpably sense from her is enormous. And so she's incredible. Single mom. She showed up at the Planetary Health Alliance conference with her kid. I didn't even know she was going. And then we got to hang out with Richard Horton of the Lancet. And then she went to an education session and completely changed the discussion because she was the only Indigenous person there, and we're talking about planetary health education, which is completely consistent with Indigenous values. So I really feel as though we have some people in Canada who are pulling more than their share of the weight on this, and I feel like there's a lot we can do to help them out. Oh yeah, there she is with her little baby. Someone else who's done a heck of a lot is Tim Tuccaro at SFU. So the health impact assessment on the Kinder Morgan pipeline, and he will tell you way more about this than I know, but it wasn't well done. It didn't take into account upstream emissions and their impact on health. It didn't take into account anything other than an ideal spill condition. So he has been asking for a proper health impact assessment to be done for years. Some of you may have had a sign-on letter that came around recently. We will be releasing that soon, asking for a health impact assessment. But this is an issue locally where there's actually a lot of investigation yet to be done that would be helpful. And here are some of my peeps at a protest basically asking for that, saying, look, you know, you're thinking about building this pipeline, and you know what, the health impacts, as far as we know, don't look good, and they've been understudied, so we need to rethink this. So it would be great if we could make a lot of clean energy and have to extract less fossil fuels. Now, one of the other things that we could do to essentially improve health and also improve the health of the planet is to eat less meat. And we're lucky right now because Health Canada is undergoing a process to make a new food guide, which will have an emphasis on plant-based protein. So, you know, comparing a high meat, low meat, or vegetarian or vegan diet has the opportunity to decrease cardiovascular disease and diabetes, and also to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions by 30 to 40%, your land use by about 30%, your water use by 30%. So it's huge. Like, as we go forward, we need the world to do this so that, you know, there's basically enough food for everybody. And we need to also this doesn't decrease CO2, but I think we need to be anticipating as we move forward, we're going to have a lot more refugees. We need to become a center of excellence for refugee care. We need to think about all of those structures. This is going to be the reality of the rest of our lives, and we need to be good at it. Now, an effort that's going underway worldwide right now that I think it's helpful for you guys to be aware of and that Penny asked me to speak to today is the Lancet Countdown. So there have been a lot of people working in silos with part of the answer, but as it's so multidisciplinary, you really need a lot of people talking to one another to be able to do this, because although health has a lot of the argument, a lot of the solutions take place outside of the hospital, whether it's the coal plant or the bike lane or whatever. So we need to be talking to one another. So this is a multi-year endeavor that is going to be published every year between 2017 and 2030. I think there's about 40 global research institutions right now, and they basically follow a list of indicators, and I think I have some on the next slide. Yeah, so this is a horribly busy slide. What you really need to know is that there's a section on health impacts, there's a section on health systems adaptation, there's a section on mitigation actions, so the things we were talking about, what can we do to improve health and decrease greenhouse gases at the same time. There's a section on economics and finance, like what financial structures do we need to have in place to enable those other things? And how do we get the message out? So public and political engagement. So what I really like about this is it's super practical. It's like, how do we actually get the job done? And it's definitely, it's already contributing sort of policy ideas. So as in association with this, they have a policy brief procedure. So I wrote the one for Canada this last year, and I'm actually in charge of the international process. So I've spent a whole bunch of time this last summer, because I'm on contract right now, helping other teams, so talking to the US team, the Brazilian team, the team in China, about how do we take this data that the Lancet's providing us, take it into the political context of our country, and come up with a discrete set of recommendations for policymakers. So I'll quickly take you through the ones we had last year. So their main messages from the Countdown report last year were that the human symptoms of climate change are unavoidable. The delayed response has jeopardized us. The voice of the health profession is incredibly important. And basically, we're still in the game. Like, there's still the possibility of a good outcome was more or less the last message. So we took a look at all the wildfires, and we were sort of part of this as a result of the wildfire study that we did. And we realized that we're starting to have conversations between health authorities and health jurisdictions about how to respond to these extreme events, but some of that hasn't been formalized. And there isn't necessarily enough support for those conversations to be built in, because these are new things, right? So new practice patterns need to emerge. So one of our recommendations was to ensure funding of research and best practices to help that process. Another one was essentially to support the coal power phase out. And so what our goal is, there's been sort of a distinct set of health benefits that have been shown if we move to 2/3 renewable energy and 1/3 like best in class gas. So we put some support behind that. Now, this is a horribly busy slide, and I apologize for it, but basically, this is about active transport. Red is not so good. Red is like private motor vehicle. Yellow is public transport, and the greens are walking and cycling. So this bit was from the international report. So Vancouver was actually the only city from Canada that was in the international report. And it's funny because it doesn't look very good there. But when you look at it, and Karen and I took this data from the National Household Survey, and it looks pretty good. It's fourth from the bottom, so it's fourth best in Canada, according to Canadian data. So there's a ton of room to move on this, and whether that's in research, in messaging, this is actually one of the friendlier places for doctors to get involved, because no one yells at you when you show up and ask for a bike line. Well, they might, but not with the same kind of vitriol. So it's good, and it decreases mortality. So the health messaging is really clear. So this is a place where we can have a really big impact, and Vancouver is actually doing a good job of this. Now, we had a discussion about this actually at one of the morning sessions about the actual health impact of, the greenhouse gas impact of moving people for healthcare. So Andrea's done an awesome job of studying the carbon footprint and other energy uses in ORs. And that's fantastic. This is another element of greening healthcare. How do we figure out how to just move less people? This is my catchment area here. So I work in the middle red dot. I service people up to the top red dot and beyond, and we have to move them if anybody needs a neurosurgeon or a cardiologist down to the bottom red dot. That's like half of Europe, right? And each one of those medevacs costs about $30,000. So this was actually Trevor Hancock's contribution, was to enhance support for telecommuting and telehealth options. And there's actually some good data to show that, yes, you decrease. So greenhouse gas emissions from healthcare, generally speaking, at least in the US, were shown to be about 10% of overall greenhouse gas emissions. So that's huge. And it's about that in most places, right, that have crunched the numbers? Here? Really? Okay. Most, I think Australia, it was around 7. Yeah. There's someone else who was 10. Who was 10? Was it the UK? Are they better? Are they better? So anyhow, I guess the US is bad, but anyway, that's still a lot. That's still a lot of, she's definitely much more of a green healthcare expert than I am. Anyhow, the transportation stuff is a big deal, and I think we can save a lot of money and patient time. The next recommendation was to provide strong health sector support to the new draft eating guidelines around plant-based diets. So, there's going to be some backlash against that. Like, we need to make sure our messaging is in support of that. And to do more studies into the health impacts of resource extraction and more health impact assessments, especially around Indigenous communities. And I just wanted to highlight, and we highlighted it in the report, a really great project that's happening in BC, run out of UNBC, and with all of these different partners by Sandra Allison and Margot Parks, the ECHO Network. So they're really trying hard to incorporate Indigenous traditional knowledge in a respectful way, as well as to come up with practical solutions around health and resource extraction. And I just, sometimes this stuff, like, what does this actually mean? I had the opportunity to go to a site in Borneo that calls itself Planetary Health in Action. And it was incredibly cool. So basically, it's critical orangutan habitat. People are cutting down the trees because they needed money for healthcare. So what they did was they built a hospital there. And then they started asking people, okay, so now we've given you a hospital, so you don't have to cut down the trees to pay for healthcare. What else do you need money for? And how can we give you alternative ways to make money? So they have a chainsaw buyback program where they essentially give small business loans so people can improve their farming implements or their fishing boats in giving them their chainsaw. They have a replanting program in the local forest because they've had their own wildfires and also because of the harvesting. And they also have 30 organic farms where they're training people to learn how to farm organically, and a Goats for Widows program where if you are a widow who needs a goat and feels like you would like a little bit of opportunity to generate your own income, they give the widows a goat, and then when the goats reproduce, the widows give a goat back, and it just keeps going. And everybody sits and has morning meeting together. So every morning meeting is everybody sitting on the floor. They spin a pen in the middle of the circle to see who chairs the meeting. And then you go around 3 times, everybody gets to say whatever they want, and then everybody legitimately cheers, which I thought was crazy, but everybody seems sincere, which was neat. But it's doctors and nurses and farmers and foresters and the people who drive the trucks and the finance people all sitting talking to one another every day. And their health outcomes, they're just being written up by some academics in the States, but they're good. They've improved health and they've really improved forest cover. So, how can we take into account all of the ecological determinants of health, the social determinants of health, because people need to make their living somehow, and healthcare structures in a sort of complete way like this? It was pretty inspiring to see. So my challenge to you is, how are we going to do that here? I think actually you've got a heck of a lot going for you here in BC. There's a lot of energy in that direction already. You've already got a clean electricity grid. There's a lot of options here that are going to work. So I leave you with this. I think sometimes we think that data or ability is what's missing, and I do think we need a lot more research. But I think what we really need is to be brave. Okay? It feels scary sometimes to do things differently than the people around you, or than the way things have been done, but that's exactly what we need to be. So I hereby give you a energetic burst of bravery, and I look forward to working with you, and keep an eye out for the next countdown brief, which will come out in November. Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. That was fantastic. You guys are all going to have opportunity to ask Courtney some questions in a few minutes. Before that, though, we're going to give Andrea McNeil an opportunity to come forward. So Dr. McNeil is a surgical oncologist in Vancouver, a clinical assistant prof here at UBC, and she has a master's in environmental change and management from the University of Oxford. She actually gave us rounds at C2E2 on Monday, so we had some insight into her research. Absolutely fascinating. Andrea, we're going to invite you to come forward, give a bit of a response to what we've heard from Courtney, and then we're going to open up the floor for a general discussion. So, Andrea, come on forward.
Thank you, Craig. I actually have just a couple of completely unnecessary slides here. Excellent. And thank you, Courtney, for an inspiring address. You are an incredible example of health sector leadership in this sphere, and I think I speak for all of us when I say that we admire your work enormously and we're immensely grateful for your efforts, so thank you. So my comments are going to address 3 of the themes that Courtney has brought up today. So we often think of climate change as a geophysical problem or an atmospheric imbalance that requires a technical solution. But as Courtney has so beautifully outlined for us, climate change is in fact a social, cultural, political, and ethical problem. It is a condition of an ailing planet that is forcing us to re-examine our human identity and grapple with questions of how we should live and what legacy we're leaving behind. And while the mind-boggling complexity and severity of climate change may at first glance leave us feeling a bit powerless and with despair, I would suggest that it's actually this plasticity of climate change, this ability to appeal to different people in countless different ways, that's going to allow us to return our planet to a sustainable trajectory. Courtney has masterfully communicated the complex interrelationships between climate change and health, showing how climate change undermines the basic prerequisites of health, like food and water, how a changing climate is exacerbating environmentally mediated disease, and how environmental instability can lead to human migration and political upheaval. If we as health professionals, and I include everybody in this room in that broad definition, want to be leaders in this sphere, it's important that we understand and similarly be able to articulate those relationships. Because as Courtney alluded to, framing climate change as a health issue rather than as some sort of partisan political issue is one of the most effective means of reaching a skeptical public with this message. The Yale program on climate change communication has identified 6 distinct audiences within the American public, ranging from alarmed to dismissive, each of which responds to the concept of climate change in a different way. Qualitative studies using this 6 Americas framework have shown that framing climate change as a public health issue is more likely to arouse hopeful emotions and support for climate change mitigation than alternative approaches that focus on, say, climate change as a national security threat or even on the environmental consequences. And this stands to reason, as Courtney said, we're all inherently self-interested and we're more likely to respond to a threat to our own health and well-being than a vague threat to a landscape thousands of kilometers away and years in the future. Furthermore, focusing on the public health benefits of climate change rather than on the health risks has been shown to be more effective in engaging people across all 6 Americas, which speaks to our need for hope and empowerment. Now, I'd suggest that within our healthcare community, there's another important angle to the story of climate and health, as Courtney's already brought up, and that's our own role in the problem and in the solution. So the health sector itself is a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions, of air pollution, and of other pollutant emissions. We're a resource-intense industry. We have 24/7 operations, high energy intensity demands, and unique environmental impacts like biohazardous and pharmaceutical wastes. As her slide indicated, the U.S. healthcare system is leading the way with 10% of national greenhouse gas emissions, and we showed that operating rooms alone have a carbon footprint equivalent to millions of cars on the road. So we can't sit back and point the finger self-righteously at the oil and gas industry when our own professional activities make a material contribution to the problem. But the convenient truth of that story is how disproportionately the health sector will reap the benefits of climate change mitigation, including from getting our own house in order. So the WHO estimates that 20% of all cancers and 44% of asthma cases are linked to environmental exposures, which means that interventions to reduce or eliminate these exposures would be expected to have massive effects on the burden of disease that our health system is currently struggling to treat. Courtney spoke about the very impressive efforts in the coal phase-out project. In Ontario alone, that will result in 31 million tons of avoided emissions per year, which will translate into hundreds fewer emergency department visits for respiratory illness, avoided mortality from cancer, and millions of healthcare dollars saved. This summer alone, 93 people in Quebec died of heat-related illness and hundreds more required medical treatment. So addressing these environmental factors that are causing thousands of Canadians to seek medical attention will alleviate a huge strain on our healthcare system. And in an era of increasing angst over the sustainability of our publicly funded system in the face of an aging population, this is an intervention we can't afford not to pursue. Restoring our planetary systems is a win-win-win for us as health professionals, as Canadian taxpayers, and as members of the general public. Now, Courtney introduced the concept of eco-anxiety, specifically with respect to wildfire smoke. And the mental health sequelae of climate change are occurring at both individual as well as societal levels, and interface with this related concept of social capital. So social capital refers to the value of our interconnectedness, or the strength of our social networks. And it has to do with trust and cultural norms like generalized reciprocity, or the idea that what goes around comes around. Communities or populations with high social capital will be more resilient to climate disturbance, whereas people who inhabit communities devoid of social capital will be particularly susceptible. For example, the eco-anxiety wrought by a changing Arctic landscape may serve to bind northern communities together with a sense of shared adversity. But it's been shown that the death toll from severe heat events is higher in inner city environments where fear and distrust lead people to die in their own homes rather than seek refuge with their neighbors who might have air conditioning. Vancouver is an affluent city with a robust and modern infrastructure, highly developed emergency services, but we are operating at a social capital deficit. A 2012 survey by the Vancouver Foundation investigated the issues facing inhabitants of Metro Vancouver. And the #1 concern identified in the survey was not affordable housing or income inequality, but a growing sense of social isolation. And further studies have confirmed that when it comes to loneliness, Vancouver's in a league of its own. This lack of robust social networks and sense of community means that many Vancouverites are acutely vulnerable to climate shocks. So if a massive storm were to flood all of our sea-level homes, or if our power were knocked out for days, or if our food and water supply were disrupted, the human suffering would be far greater than if the same event affected a small coastal community where concern for one's neighbor was a feature of daily life. This eco-anxiety elicited by consecutive summers of being blanketed by wildfire smoke is an appropriate response for a society that knows it is not resilient to a changing environment. So how does one build social capital? Well, one mechanism is by mobilizing around a common cause. And climate change threatens all of us in one way or another. So once again, we can actually derive a solution from the problem itself. By coming together to confront a shared threat, we can build ties that then actually allow us to withstand the storms that come and improve our quality of life in the interim. And I've witnessed this dynamic in the workplace, where environmental sustainability initiatives in the operating room have brought together nurses, surgeons, anaesthetists, PAs, housekeepers, flattening hierarchies and creating bonds that then strengthen the day-to-day team function. Courtney showed that health professionals are trusted members of society, and we can leverage this privileged position to shed light on the pressing issues that are facing our communities and to begin to build social capital. So how exactly should we respond to this call for health sector leadership? How do we disseminate this message of climate change as a universal and pervasive threat to human health? And how do we advocate for the changes required to transition to a low-carbon future? Well, Courtney issued a call to tell our stories, and I could not agree more. But we need to be thoughtful and strategic in our efforts to do this, and part of that is recognizing the limitations of academia. So to illustrate this, I'm going to tell you a story. In 2011, Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway published The Merchants of Doubt, a tale of deception and a tangled web of vested interests. And this story actually continues to unfold today, but the informative piece for those of us who are interested in effecting change in this arena is to examine the respective players' modus operandi. So Merchants of Doubt weaves a story of remarkable parallels between big oil and big tobacco. And most people are aware of the fact that the tobacco industry knew of the dangers of smoking years before the general public, and that they deliberately concealed this information, instead waging an elaborate campaign of misinformation to deceive the general public and commit millions of people to an addictive habit that would ultimately destroy them. A landmark case against the American tobacco industry was settled in 2006 when a DC judge ruled that the industry had, quote, marketed and sold their lethal product with zeal, with deception, and with a single-minded focus on their financial success and without regard for the human tragedy or social costs that success exacted, end quote. But it seems that big tobacco was actually just the opening act, and it's now clear that the oil and gas industry was engaging in the exact same tactics. As early as the 1970s, their own in-house scientists were raising alarm bells over the greenhouse gas effects of burned fossil fuels and the projected climate consequences. These findings were vigorously and systematically concealed, and the industry instead invested hundreds of millions of dollars in fabricating a body of pseudoscience that countered any suggestion of a warming climate and the environmental dangers of a fossil fuel-addicted economy. Despite a mounting body of now incontrovertible evidence of the atmospheric consequences of climate change, the deep-pocketed oil and gas industry was able to create an organized apparatus of doubt, which has been wildly successful in converting a scientific issue of universal concern to a deeply partisan one, characterized by profound distrust and denial. In 2013, a systematic review of nearly 12,000 climate science papers revealed a 97% consensus surrounding the evidence of planetary warming due to human activities. And yet, the most recent Gallup poll of the American public shows that a majority of Americans continue to believe that climate change won't affect them, and overall skepticism surrounding the issue is increasing. So how were they able to achieve such a remarkable feat? Well, I was fascinated when I read this book to see how the scientists did nothing wrong, and in fact, they did everything we're taught to do to succeed in academia. As more and more was discovered about the atmospheric physics involved in global warming, and models were devised to turn these data into projected scenarios of the future, a generation of climate scientists published in increasingly prestigious journals and presented their work at meetings around the world. And their academic writing contained the usual required admissions about study weaknesses and limitations. The well-oiled PR machine of the oil and gas industry, however, which incidentally involved the exact same players that the tobacco industry had used just years earlier, focused more on mainstream media channels than academic outlets. They did fund a body of pseudoscience, which they referenced extensively, but they also published editorials in the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Times and ensured that their industry-backed scientists were given plenty of airtime on television and radio, infiltrating American households with their message of climate stability and natural variation, etc. And they leapt on the notion of limitations in scientific inquiry to paint a picture of massive uncertainty and doubt. So I am by no means diminishing the importance of peer-reviewed literature and contributing to the body of knowledge, but academic literature is a slow and unwieldy agent of change, and climate change is a rapidly evolving phenomenon, the consequences of which we are experiencing on a near daily basis. It demands a response of equal magnitude and urgency. The public will not read your next publication in environmental health perspectives, but they may well read your Twitter feed. Policymakers are not scouring the periodicals for guidance in constructing cross-sectoral solutions to complex problems of health, economics, and social justice. They need authoritative voices advising them and bringing the science to them in a way that translates into solutions. And we need to publicly celebrate the CMA's divestment from fossil fuels and demonstrate that we as a profession are serious about public and planetary health, as Courtney is so brilliantly doing. The channels for mass communication available to us today are infinitely better than the machinery that the oil and gas companies had to work with. So we need to take a page out of their playbook and think outside of our ivory towers. Not for the purposes of deception, to be clear, but because change requires public engagement well beyond the walls of these institutions. Especially in this moment when the mainstream media is having a crisis over notions of truth and objectivity, and public trust is at an all-time low, the opportunity is ripe for citizen leaders to emerge and add their voice to the conversation. Now, as Courtney alluded to, this is a solvable problem. We are not in this situation for want of technological fixes or scientific breakthroughs. The barriers are political, emotional, and behavioral. There's enough solar capacity in North Africa to meet the entire world's electricity requirements. And if we all adopted a low-carbon, plant-based diet, there would be enough food to meet the needs of 7 billion people. Overcoming these barriers requires connecting with people on the level at which climate change resonates with them. And thankfully for us, the climate and health story is a very powerful one that needs to be told. It will cut across all social strata and affect us all. We are uniquely positioned, both as trusted members of society and as participants in a polluting industry, to lead by example, giving voice to the silent spring as we begin to restore our planetary systems to health. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was fantastic. I think we've had two amazing authoritative voices here for us today to speak to this incredibly important topic. I said to Courtney earlier that we may be a largely uninformed audience, but I actually was probably just speaking about myself. And I feel incredibly more educated even with just an hour of talking about this issue. So thank you both. We'd love to open it up to the floor for questions, comments. Just ask that you stand up. It's a big room. Just state who you are and where your primary affiliation is. And you can actually press, Megan is telling me to press the button in front of you, and then everyone will hear you. So don't stand up, but do say your name and your primary affiliation so we have a sense of where you're coming from. And floor is open. Yes, right up front. Go ahead.
So would you like me to
sit and use the mic is perfect.
Is that okay?
Yep.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much for your talk. My name is Dr. Sylvia Struck, and I am the manager for the Drinking Water Safety Program with the First Nations Health Authority. So we recognize the challenges that are occurring right now in our communities. We also participate with the ECHO network, and Tim Chikara is part of that. And we have also we're in the process of hiring a climate change specialist who will be working specifically with Indigenous populations in BC. So definitely would like to connect with you on that. But my question is, given the recent upheaval with the pipeline, it seems that Alberta might be backtracking on some of its commitments, or at least that's kind of the political messaging that was happening right after that occurred. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on that and whether we can still make progress.
Yeah, this is, it's difficult because our social determinants of health people haven't spoken much with our ecological determinants of health people. And I very much take responsibility for this at CAPE. We didn't even start really talking about the social determinants of health until this year, like the whole just transition conversation. I was telling someone today, I was part of the Canadian Civil Society delegation to COP, and so I went to their meetings every morning, and then I also went to the meetings of the World Medical Community. And all of the Canadian Civil Society conversation was around this concept of a just transition. So how do we support people from a social determinants of health perspective as we transition from our high carbon economy to our low carbon economy? Because as health professionals, we have a role to play in that conversation. And so far in Canada, I think partly because we've been such a small community of environmental health, climate change, and health people with like such a giant mandate, it's been sort of like, I've sometimes felt like I've been in the emergency department in the middle of the night and I have like an ectopic pregnancy person bleeding out and I'm just calling everybody I can, with like one simple message, like come to the emergency department. So I think we were so small in numbers, we didn't incorporate that conversation very well. So one thing we're doing at CAPE is to try to do a better job at addressing that conversation around the social determinants of health. So, the federal government deserves credit for the $30 million that's committed to helping coal workers transition as they phase out the coal-powered plants in Alberta. But, we're spending billions of dollars on this pipeline, right? So our priorities are not matching up with what the planet kind of needs us to do from a funds allocation standpoint. Some of you, I know, have already signed a sign-on letter that was generated. Actually, there was a big climate change and health summit in San Francisco about 2 weeks ago. The Kinder Morgan pipeline is on the radar of academics worldwide. Like, I was approached by one of basically the world's most authoritative voices in climate change and health, and we've talked about it before. He's like, okay, when are we going to get this letter done? So, in fact, Tim wrote it that day. And we started circulating it at the conference. And so we'll be releasing it soon, asking for a health impact assessment, like a proper one and an independent one, because now that Canada actually owns this pipeline, how can we be, we're not an honest broker in this conversation anymore. So this assessment needs to be done by an independent body. So that's one response. Another response is that we're accelerating our participation in the conversation around carbon taxes. So I actually got partly brought into this work by an economist in Yellowknife who'd been talking about carbon taxes for a long time, and he was actually on the board of my health authority. So he ended up hearing that there was a doctor who'd done a presentation on climate change and health, and he sent me an email and asked me over for, to him and his wife's place for brunch. And he was like, I want you to do presentations with me on carbon taxes. And I was really new at the time. And so, I did a bunch of reading on carbon pricing, and I was like, well, I can support that. The World Bank supports it. IMF supports it. A physician was in charge of the World Bank who'd done a lot of work on global health. I was like, okay, I think we can do this. And so we would do presentations where I would give the rationale for action, basically. So similar to what a 7 years ago version of what you saw here that was frankly a lot more doomsday. I've learned that audiences can only take so much to spare. But when they looked like they wanted to jump off a cliff and they were like this, I'd be like, and here's Doug with the solution, the carbon tax solution. And it worked great because I all of a sudden had an action item that was really clear and evidence-based, and he had a rationale. And so it worked really well. We ended up passing a motion in the Canadian Medical Association subsequent to that. So the CMA actually has policy to support carbon pricing. Its policy states the CMA will promote the health benefits of carbon pricing, because just like by phasing out coal, if you reduce fossil fuel burning, you also reduce air pollution, which has all the associated health impacts or health benefits. And so it's going to be one of the items we're covering in the Lancet Countdown brief this year. Our doctors in Alberta are talking about it. And this is all being peer reviewed by academics who specialize in this stuff. And we're looking at a bunch of different partnerships. So what we're trying to do, we try to be, I don't think there's any benefit to any of us getting explicitly political, We're just trying to do a better job at partnering with the people who we need to partner with to ask for what needs happening and just essentially be better messengers and make the connections that sometimes haven't been made before. Does that answer your question? Kinda?
It's a challenging question, but yes,
well,
it's a good job of addressing.
Yeah, I think, and it's challenging because the governments have done some good things, So the Powering Past Coal Alliance, I'll give you a heads up, that's mentioned in the next Countdown report, right? So our government has done some things that are internationally well recognized, but, the balance is still not quite there, and we need to, and it's interesting from a human relationship standpoint, because you start to want to be nice, so you have to hold your ground and be like, look, it still wasn't a good move, and be willing to say that. So we actually did say that publicly. I had several interviews. CAPE issued a press release about Kinder Morgan. I think we're the only health-related organization that did. So yeah, it does feel awkward. There are a lot of days where you're like, but you got to do it anyway. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for highlighting that this really is a public health issue, and I'm really happy that we're having that discussion. With that in mind, what is public health doing? How can we engage them more? Because I don't hear anything from BC Public Health, and I don't know how it is across the country.
So this is a really big discussion, and it has to do, we were talking about this again during one of our sessions earlier today. So I work in acute care, and I get all the money, right? So meaning that in terms of the determinants of health, we're not spending our money where it has the biggest bang for the buck. So our poor public health doctors, they get very little resource for what we're asking them to do. And also, there's political constraints on them that clinicians don't have. So depending on the province, for instance, in the Northwest Territories where I live, they're hired by government. So, and that's similar in many places, not all places, but many. And so the independence of the politically of the public health voice, it can be pretty awkward for them. So they have sort of the double constraints of A, resource limitations, and B, if they happen to be feeling uncomfortable on behalf of their population about an issue that's a political priority for the people who hired them, that can be really awkward. And unfortunately, there's precedent in Canada for them to have true problems. So David Swan, Penny mentioned earlier, got fired in Alberta for talking about climate change a few years ago. Ailish Cleary in New Brunswick, they actually had to have public protests to get her report on fracking released. And then that sort of went okay. And then she started studying glyphosate, which is the key ingredient in Roundup. And then she lost her job in circumstances that have not been publicly disclosed. And then there's the story of John O'Connor, who lives downstream from the oil sands as a family doc who tried to talk about the health impacts and also his license got put in jeopardy. Health Canada issued 4 official complaints against him. It took him years and like a lot of turmoil to clear his name. So there's issues with regards to, so there's issues for everybody about personal risk, which is why it's so important. Like one of the presentations I gave, it talks about your home team is really, 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 really important for us to support one another as a home team. Because everyone will have a different place on the spectrum in terms of action, and there's no question that the issues around fossil fuel extraction are the most demanding from a stress perspective. We need to make sure that we are supporting our docs like Tim Takaro, who are being super courageous in saying what needs to be said, and just make sure that they know that we kind of have their back. So yeah, resources and political constraints.
Is there a way to provide that support in enmeshment?
Yeah, so, they also, social license comes into play for them also. So as clinicians, most of us are pretty free in terms of what we can say. Like there's a lot of other people in the health system who can say things freely. So if a public health doc is feeling worried, but meanwhile, all of the doctors in that community are being, look, like there's an issue with this mine or whatever, that creates a lot of space for them. I also talk a lot about there's this weird separation between public health and clinicians. I had to argue tremendously in Yellowknife to have, basically, we get CME, and they didn't want to pay for my CME to go to a public health conference because they said I wasn't part of the public health system. And I happened to have a document defining the public health system open on my document because I was on the committee for public health as the clinician. So it was really frustrating. But anyway, this exists. That's silly. We're all extensions of public health. And, in terms of the CARMS criteria, the CanMEDS criteria, advocate is one of the roles that we're teaching medical students. And that has a lot of potential for public health involvement. So I think if we increase support for one another, if we do what we can to create political space for our public health docs, sometimes we end up just saying what they can't say. Personal relationships are really important too. So sometimes people come to me and they're like, hey, I'm worried about this. I can't say anything. Can CAPE address this? And so CAPE, that's a role that CAPE plays in Canada. Our associations are really important. So professional associations providing support for themselves. So sometimes the doc can't say it, but the Public Health Professional Association can come out with a position statement. And actually the BC Public Health Association has been really good with that. So those are some of the avenues.
Andrew, do you want to add anything?
The only thing I really have to add from that is, it's not from the public health community, but I think there's increasing awareness amongst those of us who are in acute care and treating one extreme end of a spectrum of health, which is end-stage disease, that the impact of prevention on a systems level and a planetary level. And so a lot of us are wearing hats as surgeons and also public health advocates. One of my mentors is a melanoma surgeon, and she lobbied the Ontario government for restrictions on tanning bed use. And I have colorectal surgery colleagues who have put in place colorectal cancer screening programs and just ways to divert resources from the end of the line where a few people consume an enormous amount of resources to try to redirect those into an upstream investment where the impact can be greater.
So, Andrea, maybe I'll just put a question to you, Sterling Bryan, a scientist at the centre. So I'm sort of struck by just the urgency of this issue, and the work that you've done, that you presented to us on Monday, shows dramatic improvements in VGH in terms of the switch, but still about 30% use of the gases that have the big impact on. So why don't we just if this is an urgent issue, let's just mandate that things need to change, rather than actually like coerce or cajole or, you know, persuade people to change their behaviour, and stubbornly some people don't. Like, you know, we just need to mandate that that action is needed. So that's my question to you. My question to Craig is, what are you eating at dinner tonight?
Definitely not meat. For those who know me, that will be a change. So thank you.
Nice work. Yeah, you're quite right. The time frame does necessitate a certain expediency. I am of two minds of this, or actually I think I can kind of reconcile it somewhere in the middle, where obviously there is a benefit to empowerment and a grassroots movement and people feeling like they're making a difference and contributing in a material sense. There is actually literature on the workplace benefits in terms of employee attrition and engagement and time off and things like that when they are engaged in sustainability initiatives, because it gives them a sense of meaning and purpose that actually overflows into the broader workplace and can combat workplace toxicity, et cetera. So I don't minimize that side of things. And I think there's a point at which they can kind of meet in the middle. We've seen a tremendous effect from our anesthesia community being engaged on this issue of the global warming potential of the gases that they use. And as I showed you on Monday, in 4 years, our 7 lower mainland hospitals have reduced their emissions by 75% based on voluntary practice changes alone. So that's, I mean, it just speaks to the engagement of that community. And I think that engagement will now be channeled into further endeavors that might not lead themselves to the sort of top-down regulation that we can now apply to eliminating the most harmful gases. So at this point, I think no one in that community would object to the hospital eliminating desflurane or restricting its use. But there are other ways that we need to now redirect the energy that's come from that into other avenues where it's just not so easily regulated.
And there's 2 in the back, so the first one, yeah, and then one behind you. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Peter Wood, and I'm the National Campaign Manager for the Blue Dot Movement for Environmental Rights. And I just wanted to follow up on the conversation, the comment earlier about, you know, why don't we just mandate that something be done? Because our own campaign has taken a rights-based approach to addressing environmental health issues, and that we would like to see ultimately having a national law on environmental rights that would make it a little bit stronger than just leaving it to voluntary measures. A shameless plug, we have 100,000 people coast to coast active on this. We've passed 172 municipal declarations that now those cities and towns require environmental rights be incorporated into all decision making. We're now going for a push at the federal level in the lead up to the next election, and there's nothing like an election to get commitments from politicians. If you're at all interested in taking part in that, bluedot.ca, I'd be glad to sign people up. Thanks.
And that's something you can actually do as a healthcare association. So the Northwest Territories Medical Association actually passed that resolution. I don't know if you knew that. The nurses in the Yukon have also. It's a pretty easy thing to do, you know. Like in terms of targets, when you're, you know, you picked a great target in terms of systems change because it was achievable and it didn't require too much disruption to people's day, and it made a big difference. And so that's, like, as you said, like a movement building thing, you know, not easy wins. That was not easy, but wins beget energy, which beget other wins and progress. So passing a resolution like that, actually, it starts to generate the conversation. It starts to get people on board. There's not a giant risk to it. So you have that conversation, and then you're like, okay, so what about that, you know, bike lane or mine or whatever? It can actually lead to further change within your community because it's part of the building of the movement and sort of the narrative. So yeah, I would encourage you to pass that. I think you've got wording for those motions on the website, right? Yeah, it's great.
And I might just, can I elaborate on that? Just one other thing. I think there are very few areas that fall into that, that are analogous to the example of anaesthetists being able to choose which anesthetic gas they use. That is practice pattern decisions. I am completely in favor of top-down regulation when it comes to hospital construction, green building standards, operations, so optimizing energy use and efficiency, eliminating unnecessary single-use consumables, and a lot of the things in the healthcare system that just generate waste and emissions for no purpose. But I think physician community in particular right now is very sensitive. Morale is low. We feel like we're being told how to do our jobs from a lot of different levels, and adding one more level to that may prove counterproductive. But thankfully, behavioral change amongst clinicians is actually a minority of the impactful targets that we have identified for greening healthcare.
Go ahead in the back.
Hi. I'm Tim Takaro. I'm the guy who has the hands in that black goop that is known as diluted bitumen. Thank you so much, Andrea and Courtney, for a wonderful talk. And I just wanted to speak to the action items because there are a number of good ideas out here and great opportunities. British Columbia is in this moment of history where we could actually stop a pipeline. And that would make a big difference to the planet. And we have the political tools in place, actually, in this province. And I just want to entreat you to participate. There is 22 weeks left that the National Energy Board is going to consider the impacts of this pipeline. And a public process is beginning. I just heard today that they're going to give us a week to sign up, and people are, of course, very incensed that it's not more time to sign up to participate. But I encourage you to participate, even if it is only having conversations around your kitchen table about the connectedness of the problem that it was so well described today, and our own abilities here in the province to stop a pipeline. So the clock is ticking. I hope you will get involved.
I don't think he introduced himself, so for people who don't know, that's the Tim Takaro I kept talking about. So if you want to know about the health impacts of the Kinder Morgan pipeline, go talk to him. So just like briefly, do you want to just give us give us your top 4. What are your top 4 speaking points?
So it depends on where you're coming from.
1 minute.
If you're if you're about the toxins of a spill, it's benzene. And dilbate is diluted bitumen that you take the tar and you dilute it with essentially gasoline and very, very high benzene content. So childhood leukemia is the big player there. All of the issues that you brought up on climate change, the pipeline is part of a large infrastructure that will last at least 30 to 40 years. And it's been clear that we have to stop building these large infrastructures that burn the Alberta tar sands. So the second is, of course, to make the connections with climate change and the reserves that are stranded assets. We have to get past the fact that we are not going to make money off of the tar sands. So the pick your favorite climate change impact, be it forest fires, be it heat events, be it air pollution, be it drought or extreme rain events. Pick the one you want to make the connection, which means the most to you. It is about that story. So, yeah, tell your story.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Let's just go with one more question.
There we go. Hi, my name is Ray Pataki. I work down the street at BC Cancer, but this is unrelated to cancer generally. But when you were talking about sort of building on wins and building that momentum, what do you see as sort of the next steps or the next targets for divestment campaigns? Because I know, looking at the top of your, most trusted professionals, between, university endowments, public pension funds, there's a lot of money there, but obviously these are huge targets for divestment. So how do you think, we could make progress in those areas?
I don't know what the status of the UBC divestment campaign is. Does anybody know? Yeah. Yeah, so we didn't talk about the carbon bubble, and that's really relevant to this conversation. So what Tim was talking about in terms of stranded assets, so in about 2011, this group called the Carbon Tracker Initiative produced the first report that talked about the carbon bubble. And what they're going for there is that, so there's all these fossil fuel deposits in the ground. Some of them we know about and they're off in Young Corner and nobody sort of has a plan for them. Some of them are already on the books of the world's national and fossil fuel companies. And so, you know, they say this coal deposit sort of belongs to me, it's in my work plan. And what actually happens is that lends value to their stock market price. So in previous instances where people, those are called their reserves. So in previous instances where people have had to change, they said, oh, we kind of screwed up, we don't have as many reserves as we thought, their stock market price has dropped commensurately. So there's actually a giant financial risk to us to keep investing in fossil fuels. Because essentially, either we keep investing in them, we extract them all, we end up at systemic and economic collapse and we lose all the money, or we don't, or we keep investing in them, and then the world basically creates effective climate change policies, in which case we have to leave them in the ground. 70 to 80% of those need to stay in the ground for us to hit our Paris targets. And so imagine the stock market price of all of the world's fossil fuel companies dropping by 70%. So Mark Carney, who used to be the head of the Bank of Canada, who's now the outgoing head of the Bank of England, has been sounding the alarm on this urgently, with increasing urgency. He's even asking different companies to start to climate test their sort of plans and their strategies. So there's a bunch of different arguments. There's a do no harm argument from a healthcare perspective. There's a long-term financial risk perspective, and also when you look at how fossil fuel funds have done over the past 5 to 8 years since we've been tracking them, compared to their similar indices that contain fossil fuels, the fossil-free funds have been doing slightly better. So you always run into this argument of fiduciary responsibility. There's no evidence for that I can see. But, there is inertia. There's the way things have always been done. Different people have different relationships to the fossil fuel industry in terms of, what's been put bread on the table for their families in the past. And I think we need to, recognize that those are heartfelt arguments for people. So I think we need to have compassion for people on all sides of the spectrum, but it is a really big area that's really seeing a lot of momentum. So this audience, I would try to get UBC to divest.